Okay, so thank you very much, Ben, for this overly generous introduction, and thank you very much to all of you. It's really a pleasure to be here, and especially in the moment where these two wonderful institutions join together. So what I propose to do today is to use Carl Schmitt as a lens through which to analyze political and legal responses, mainly legal, but also political responses, to the growing presence of Islam in the European public sphere. And basically, I will confine myself to three elements of Schmitt's constitutional theory: the polarity of friend and enemy, the necessarily homogeneous character of democracy, and most importantly, the necessity to protect democracy beyond the state of exception. Now, why do I want to rely on Schmitt? Of course, there's a twofold reason for that. The first reason is that Schmitt certainly exposed very lucidly certain loops of European liberalism and certain limits of civil society that are very clearly perceivable in today's responses to the growing presence of Muslims in the European public sphere. And today, reading Schmitt still is still useful because he raises uncomfortable questions that have to do not only with the fragility of constitutional democracy, but also, oh, okay, it's under control, good. I was beginning, yes, to get a little nervous. So, but another element of Carl Schmitt is that he also challenges this liberal and cosmopolitan project of universal democracy, so he's particularly useful. However, the purpose of my talk is not just to use Schmitt as a prism through which to look at the cultural clashes generated by the presence of Muslims in Europe, but to go a little further. What I would like to convince you of is that such responses somehow follow a Schmittian logics. So it's not just about Schmitt being a good sociologist, it's about Schmitt's influencing very deeply political and legal responses to Islam in the public sphere, which is, of course, very problematic because this means that Western democracies, in responding to Islam in the public sphere, somehow deviate from the post-World War II model of democracy, pluralistic democracy, that European countries identify with. So, it's pretty clear that Carl Schmitt has deeply influenced political and legal thinking in the last century. Everybody still loves him on the left, on the right, on both sides of the Atlantic, but specifically in Europe. It's also true that even the most enthusiastic fans of Carl Schmitt, such as Chantal Mouffe, among other theorists, are well aware of the dangers of Schmitt's political theory. So, of course, the idea is always not to read Schmitt in order to attack political democracy, but somehow to use Schmitt to improve it. So to read with and against Schmitt at the same time. However, my problem here is that there is another dark side of Carl Schmitt, that the fascination with his work seems to systematically obscure, which is his anti-Semitism. Usually anti-Semitism in Carl Schmitt is either ignored or somehow portrayed as one of opportunity. He was vain, he wanted to be a public intellectual, but it's never portrayed or very randomly portrayed as a fundamental or a structural element of his political theory. So generations of continental scholars, including my generation, have been exposed to a lot of Carl Schmitt without any filter, basically, without any mention or let alone any in-depth analysis of his anti-Semitism. There will be a somehow embarrassed en passant reference to his involvement in the Third Reich, and that's it. However, in the past years, there has been an increased interest among scholars, and some scholars have begun to show that anti-Semitism constitutes a structural element of Schmitt's theory, and that his political theory founds its logical fulfillment in a racist ideology. Now, of course, anti-Semitism operates at many different levels in Carl Schmitt's thinking. On the one hand, Carl Schmitt associated the Jews with images of abstraction and dynamic social change, and of course reproached the spiritless interpretation of constitutional law that he associated with Kelsen. There's a point in his writing where he stops talking about Kelsenian, but he starts talking about Jewish interpretation. So clearly the two overlap. However, what I find most interesting here is that at another level, Schmitt's anti-Semitism cannot be disentangled from his somehow Christian sources of inspiration. Schmitt was deeply influenced not only by his Catholic upbringing, but also by certain fringes of German Protestantism, and mostly by the structure, the doctrine, and the historical and symbolic role of the Catholic Church. To the latter, Schmitt also attributed a very peculiar and fundamental role in shaping European identity, and I will go back to this part towards the end of my talk. So clearly, Schmitt's anti-Semitism was not a kind of biological racism. He's way too smart to fall for biological racism as a political category. It's a cultural kind of racism. So what I would want to show here is that mutatis mutandis, echoes of this anti-Semitic logics that we can find in Carl Schmitt are clearly perceivable in the way European democracies address both politically and legally cultural and religious conflicts that arise in their increasingly pluralistic polities. And this is particularly evident if one compares the treatment of Islam and Christianity in the European public spheres, in the case law of the European Court of Justice, of the European Court of Human Rights, in the European Union enlargement dynamics, think of Turkey, etc., etc. So just some very, very quick examples from different European countries. In Switzerland, during the 2007 electoral campaign, a number of posters basically caused a political earthquake. All of these posters were from the Swiss People's Party, the largest party in parliament. One, for example, showed against the backdrop of a Swiss flag, 3 white sheep kicking a lone black one out of their flock, and the slogan on the poster said, "For more security." Then there was another one with veiled women saying, "Where are we living, in Baden or Baghdad?" Then you had the minaret issue. About almost 60% of Swiss voters decided in a referendum against the building of minarets, and the General Secretary of the Swiss People Party told the BBC this was a vote against minarets as a symbol of Islamic power. In 5 German länder, we have laws that prohibit civil servants from wearing Muslim symbols, but not Christian symbols, including nun habits. And one minister in Bavaria said, well, of course, nuns' habits are not political symbols, whereas the headscarf is a political symbol that clashes with the equality of women. In Belgium, we had an incredible story after, 11 bills were introduced to try and ban the full-face veil. Finally, in 2001, the whole Belgian parliament, with 1 vote against, the vote by a wonderful friend and colleague, a human rights professor who did her homework before voting, obviously. In any case, almost unanimous parliament voted to ban the full-face veil. And by the way, Belgium had no government. I don't know if you're aware that for over 400 days, the intensification of the conflict between the 2 linguistic communities in Belgium had prevented the Belgians from having a government, so they couldn't even literally speak to one another, yet everybody felt the need to ban the full-face veil that was worn maybe by around 200 women. In the Netherlands, which is another very interesting country, because here we have a different reaction in a country that that had a particularly compromise-oriented political system. Populist parties have introduced many changes, and they started somehow relying on the idea of the clash of civilization, etc., etc., in order to introduce a number of bills. Here again, we not have a law yet, but a number of bills to ban the full-face veil. We have a particularly interesting one which says that the wearing of the full-face veil is contrary to the rule of law. Now, of course, the most striking example is the 2010 law in France that criminalized full-face veil in the public space. The interesting document here is not the law, is actually the proposed resolution by the French Assembly in preparation of the enactment of the law that relies very, very clearly on a radical opposition between French values and values assumably symbolized by the full-face veil. For example, in one passage. The drafters of the resolution stress the power and the duty we have to oppose ideologies and ways of thinking represented by the full-face veil that one can only qualify as barbarian, in the sense that they deny the idea of progress, civilization, democracy, sex-based equality. It's our value system which is at issue. It is our republic that is being tested in this way. And very tellingly, the word enlightenment, lumière, appears very often in this document. In one case, it is juxtaposed with the word barbarity. Okay, in Austria, as we were discussing this morning, has recently enacted a very controversial law banning foreign fundings for Muslim religious activities and somehow requiring a bona fide official translation of the Quran. Now, all of these examples, and we can go back to during the Q&A time to all of these examples, but what I'm interested in showing here is that they reveal that vitriolic attacks on Islam and Islamic values have become a leitmotif of European political life. And interestingly, Islamophobia seems capable of gluing together apparently irreconcilable components of European democracies, from the frankly racist populist parties to Christian conservative circles, to enlightened liberal defenders of women's rights, etc., etc. The common discourse here is the accusation of adhering to a value system or a culture that is incompatible with Western democracies. So it's about the insurmountability of cultural differences. A prominent French intellectual whom I very much admire, Etienne Balibar, has maintained that in Europe the category of immigration has substituted the category of race, thus enabling new racist discourses. These new racist discourses are about the harmfulness of abolishing frontiers, the incompatibility of lifestyles and traditions. Paradoxically, these differentialist or cultural racists present themselves as a cure against real biological racism. You know, if you don't respect a certain cultural threshold or tolerance threshold, then the real racists are going to come back. So what Balibar points out is that, of course, this kind of racism is not at all a new phenomenon. I'm actually quoting his article, "Modern anti-Semitism presents all of the traits of cultural racism. It is that of a cultural tradition, a ferment of moral disintegration. Anti-Semitism is supremely differentialist, and in many respects, the whole current differentialist racism might be considered as a generalized anti-Semitism. This consideration is particularly important for the interpretation of contemporary Islamophobia, since it carries with it an image of Islam as a conception of the world which is incompatible with Europeanness and an enterprise of universal ideological domination." Now, of course, Balibar's analysis dates back to the beginning of the 90s, and it's confined to France now after the proliferation of Muslim discourses, the attacks on the Twin Towers, etc., etc., especially in Europe, where Islam and immigration basically completely overlap, which is different from here and the United States. And this is important because this means that very different dimensions of otherness somehow all overlap: the disprivileged, immigrant, poor, religious, etc., etc. And Islam has really become an utterly other, which from the somehow point of view of the law has entailed a confusion between a religion and a inimical political ideology that ends up with very sad cases. The religious freedom of European Muslim has been really curtailed to a point that is not logically understandable if you put it together with the traditional protection of religious freedom in Europe. It is somehow possible, I think, to draw a parallel with the exclusion of Catholics in the Toleration Act of 1689, which was justified by John Locke on the ground that their church, I'm quoting, was so constituted that all who enter it ipso facto passed into the allegiance and service of another prince. Muslims are disloyal. Okay, So, of course, of all religions-related conflicts, the controversies over religious symbols are particularly good ones. I understand in Canada, too, you're having your niqab moment. And, of course, they're interesting to analyze this construction of Islam as, as an irreconcilable, a threatening political other, because religious symbols play such an important role in identity-related dynamics. On the one hand, they allow for the construction of simplified identities that are completely artificial, because, of course, the veil is depicted as Muslim, as if all Muslims wanted to wear the veil or thought the same thing or had the same dress code. The crucifix, on the other hand, is depicted as the somehow legacy of the Christian European Western tradition, as if Christian unity did not break up in the 16th century, and certainly not very harmoniously. So there is obviously something very artificial, yet they evoke on question belongings, and so they're particularly appealing. On the other hand, political symbols also, the religious symbols clearly mark the public sphere, because the mandatory presence of the crucifix in courtrooms or schools, etc., clearly marks the identification between the culture of the majority and the state, whereas a law that bans or limits the right to wear certain Muslim symbols clearly suggests the marginalization of the culture that such symbols are somehow assumed to represent. So the European Court of Human Rights, whenever it dealt with the veil or niqab, hijab, etc., now I don't want to underestimate the differences between these different attires. What I'm trying to suggest is that they are somehow singularly constructed as an anti-democratic, anti-feminist paradigm. I'm, of course, not suggesting that they're all the same from inside. I'm just trying to look how they are perceived by courts. So the European Court of Human Rights, in every case that when it has dealt with a ban over the right to wear any kind of traditional Muslim attire, it has decided that this ban is compatible and consistent with the European Convention of Human Rights. And the argument is always the same. States are better placed to decide over the application of the convention in ways that respect their constitutional system. And the veil is somehow difficult to reconcile with Western democracy. The court says this very, very clearly. In a Swiss case, it is difficult to reconcile the veil with gender equality, which is a cornerstone of any democratic system. It's actually interesting because it's even in the Turkish case, Sahin v. Turkey, the court decided that Turkey did not violate the convention by banning the headscarf, and here Muslims are the majority. So irrespective of whether Muslims are the minority or the majority, the answer is always there is something inherently pernicious about what the veil represents. And then if you look at the crucifix case, however, you get a different perception, because the court, I don't know if you're familiar with the crucifix case, this was a particularly troubling one because the court changed its mind in a very radical way between the chamber decision and the grand chamber decision, somehow suggesting that the court's case law on religious freedom is really very unstable, and also that when the court decides cases in a context of deep cultural controversy, the problem of maintaining the authority of the court and really acting as a counter-majoritarian body is somehow very, very, very weak. In any case, what happened in the second decision was that the court decided that the mandatory displays of the crucifix in Italian state schools does not violate the convention, and it distinguished the crucifix from the headscarf on the ground that the headscarf is a powerful religious symbol, whereas the crucifix is mainly a passive symbol, somehow suggesting that the crucifix does not clash with secularism, and actually to the opposite, it is an integral structural part of the European secular public sphere. Now, by the way, there is a long history among Italian judges to, saying strange things like that secularism should not be taken away from Italian schools in the name of secularism because it represents the principle of secularism. So somehow there, you can see everything. But I will go back to this because this is something that I think is particularly, this attitude towards the crucifix that can represent whatever is a particularly good indicator. Okay, so secularism is somehow Christianity just by another name in the construction of the court. You can have passive crucifixes, but you can't have powerful religious symbols such as the headscarf. However, the escalation of the European court in constructing Muslims as a threat to secular democracy, reached its highest peak in the French decision on SAS v. France, where the court said that the French ban was justified on the ground of vivre ensemble, or living together, which is a very vague and far-fetched notion that is not listed in the convention as one of the legitimate bases upon which rights can be, the enjoyment of rights can be restricted. However, now this is a particularly disturbing case on many different levels. But the court has certainly paved the way in a previous case, which is Dogru v. France. And this case is particularly interesting because here the problem was an 11-year-old kid who didn't want to remove her headscarf during gym classes and was expelled. What the court says here is that this event had led to a general atmosphere of tension within the school. And then secularism is a constitutional principle, a founding principle of the Republic to which the entire population adheres, and the protection of which appears to be of prime importance, in particular in school. Accordingly, I'm quoting, an attitude which fails to respect that principle will not necessarily be accepted as being covered by the freedom to manifest one's religion and will not be so enjoy the protection of the convention. So, what the court did here was to authorize France to adopt preventive measures to protect secularism from attitudes and take into account the kind of attitude we're talking about, a kid that doesn't want to take the headscarf off during gym classes. So the court somehow opened the door to a very significant widening of the power of states to somehow preventively remove individual manifestations of religious freedom that cause tension and are felt as not sufficiently respectful of the way we want to live together. Which brings me to my next point. It seems to me that there is a clear analogy between this line of reasoning and the logics of militant democracy. Militant democracy, you all know what it is. It is the idea that non-democratic parties can be disbanded only on the basis of their agenda and ideology. So in the absence of any actual effort to implement this ideology of agenda, certain parties are just not welcome and can be disbanded because there is a slippery slope logic here. If you allow a fascist or Nazi party to compete in free elections, of course chances are that if this party wins, then this party is going to destroy democracy from within. Now, this argument is exactly the same that when it comes to Muslim religious symbols. There's never a problem of infringing anybody else's rights. It's just that these symbols are felt as representing values that are a threat to the way we want to live together. However, the problem with using the logics of militant democracy in the field of religious freedom is that militant democracy is based on a paradox according to which certain restrictions to political pluralism are necessary in order to maintain the very possibility of political pluralism. So I get rid of Nazi parties because I want the other parties to be able to compete in a healthy, pluralistic political arena. But once you apply this logic to religious freedom, as you see here, the logic goes exactly the other way. It's about eliminating pluralism that causes tension. It's about somehow eliminating manifestations that seem to threaten substantive conceptions of democracy. And this conception of democracy, a democracy that has to be guarded against the threats of pluralism, clearly digs its roots into Carl Schmitt's theory of the constitutional state. Do I have another 5 minutes? Okay, so Schmitt's conception of democracy was clearly an essentialist, an absolute one. So according to Schmitt, a democratic state is not based on equality, okay? It's based on homogeneity. And the argument here is that all political communities are based on a constitutive somehow distinction or dichotomy between outsiders and insiders. This famous polarity of friend and enemy. And it's important to stress out that friends and enemy in Schmitt's thought have no content in themselves. They are just oppositional positions that are capable of unifying members of a group. So the enemy can be outside, but it can also be inside the state. And it doesn't have to be, Schmitt says, it doesn't have to be ugly, it doesn't have to be a grotesque monster. The enemy doesn't even have to be a moral opposite, but it has to be capable of sufficiently threaten a group's way of life. So the enemy is the other, the stranger, or der Fremde in German. So political equality, according to Schmitt, cannot be based on a non-exclusive equality of all human beings as moral persons. Because political communities, including democratic political communities, according to Schmitt, rest on markers of identity and difference that can ground an exclusive form of political equality, which can only apply to insiders. Now I'm actually quoting Schmitt, equal rights make good sense where homogeneity exists. Therefore, every democracy rests on the principle that not only equals are equals, but unequals will not be treated equally. So equality makes sense among equals, but non-equals are excluded. So democracy requires homogeneity and then elimination or eradication. Of course, pluralism poses a particularly pernicious problem to democracies. Schmitt saw pluralism as the product of historical events. But according to him, when a democracy is threatened by pluralism, it should try to pursue a form of artificial homogeneity by excluding the other. So homogeneity is not just a natural product of history. It can be an artificial achievement that all democratic states should try and pursue when they are threatened by pluralism. And the other important thing is that, according to Schmitt, pluralism is pernicious because it reduces, because by the idea that you can allow individuals to have more than one loyalty, not just to the state, but also to other spheres, reduces the sphere to the state to the same level of like non-political spheres, like religious communities, etc., etc. So, according to Schmitt, all democracies have to be guarded against pluralism beyond the state of exception in ordinary times in order to ensure stability and duration. And because the essence of a democracy is to ensure the political unity of the people, of course, the fight against pluralism and against those who threaten this unity is a particularly important one in his construction. Now, of course, I understand that it's somehow ironic that we are talking about cases and laws here because the whole point in Carl Schmitt is that these decisions that have to do to whom is the enemy, how shall we fight the enemy, are decisions that courts and parliaments should not take. These are decisions for the political that represents and feels somehow can feel the unitary folk's desires, etc. However, it's pretty clear that in today's democratic dynamics, the exclusion of the Muslim enemy by parliaments and courts is the product of the annoyance, the resentment, the fears that majorities experience in an era of globalization and mass-scale migration. So they reflect the desire of majorities to re-establish clear-cut boundaries between the self and the other, to reduce the visibility of the other in the public sphere in order to guard the supposedly homogeneous character of the European public sphere. However, the problem is that there's no homogeneous public sphere. European public sphere is not homogeneous. Homogeneity, unity, and identity don't really exist. They are nothing more than a myth. In the Schmittian construction, unity is presupposed. It's not about real people. The people Schmitt talks about is not a real people. Real people are about dynamics, conflict, difference. The people of Carl Schmitt is a transcendent subject. This is like a romantic totality that results from a process of abstraction and idealization. There is absolutely nothing else. Now, another, and this will be my last point, important point, however, is that, as I said in the beginning of my talk, the Catholic Church has a very important role in Schmitt's understanding of European identity. The Catholic Church, according to Schmitt, was superior because of its capacity of representation. So, and in the strength of its representation. And in effect, if you read Schmitt, you understand very quickly that it's completely irrelevant what the church really represents. Even if it doesn't represent anything, it's just about its capacity to represent, which makes it political. So, The problem is that Schmitt attributed, and somehow the whole political atmosphere in those years when Schmitt operated, attributed to, or somehow accused Jews of threatening European traditional Christian values with their modernity. What Muslims are accused today is of threatening European liberal, gender equality-oriented values with their medieval thinking, and they're not liberal enough. This is one of the, their anti-feminist paradigm, etc., etc. But this is exactly the same dynamic. It's just relying on an essentialized and completely artificial notion of who the people are. It's about drawing, it's about inflicting the stigmata of otherness on a group, a scapegoat that is identified precisely in order to, fulfill this unity and homogeneity requirement. So there has been a lot of writing concerning the fact that Europe needs both Jews and Muslims in order to construct and maintain its identity, because Jews are the traditional theological enemy, and Muslim the traditional historical element. And this, I think, is also a very important line of reasoning to take into account contemporary Islamophobia. But my conclusion is a rather pessimistic one. Schmitt's analysis of European identity is still a very powerful one, because it really challenges the very idea of a possible cosmopolitan European public sphere. We really have to watch what we're doing as Europeans, because there is a symbolic dimension, etc., etc., but it's not just symbolic. It somehow goes beyond. These conflicts testify to a very deep difficulty that European experience. Europeans have a huge, history of identitarian derailment. And this all of this proliferation of anti-Muslim laws and cases clearly testify to the construction of a very artificial and exclusionary kind of unity in Europe at the expenses of universalism, pluralism, and fundamental rights. So somehow I wonder whether there isn't a rather bitter irony behind all this, if as Europeans we don't have to think about actually preserving our pluralistic democracies beyond the state of exception, precisely not to fall in this kind of periodical identitarian derailment that we seem to be so prone to. Thank you.
So we have about a half an hour for a conversation, and I'll happily keep a list and look around the room for people that would like to begin. So, I thought you did.
I had, but I didn't want to miss it go first.
Oh, well,
but
well, you will be.
yeah, I don't mind. Thank you. It was a fascinating talk, and I'm sorry I missed some crucial bits probably. So my question may actually have already been addressed. But I think it's hugely important and extremely discouraging. It's a hugely important moment. It's an extremely discouraging moment, it seems to me. We've just been involved in doing some thinking about the sort of after tariffs and that the signification of that event. And I worry. I guess I suppose one comment, kind of question about your Schmittian meeting. It seems to me that Schmitt's critique is potentially less easier to kind of put in the box of a kind of essentialism than it is really the recognition that Schmitt was a secularist almost all the way down. I would argue against Heinrich Meyer, and that really what he proposes is, on the one hand, a recognition of the kind of inescapable nihilism of modern politics as having no foundation, but also, if you call it perhaps a purely existential or purely formal idea of the political, and rather than essentialist. But of course, because it's purely formal, you can stick any content, as it were, into that pure form, and I think that's precisely why, it makes him sound potentially less of a fascist. I mean, I don't agree that he was, and I don't think you do either a nationalist or a Catholic revolutionary thinker like Benito Cortes or those people.
Yeah.
But it's worth trying to think, I guess, retain some of those aspects of his critique of liberalism and the problem of how pluralism degenerates into what he calls like this endless conversation, an endless debate which goes nowhere and has no political fruitfulness. And so one of the things that strikes me about the Schmittian insight is that what are fundamental political struggles or problems are being expressed in terms of state, in terms of the law, and in terms of the logic of a security state, or a state that takes on increasingly overweening powers and engages in sometimes kind of unhinged overreach. Because the French case, of course, is patent, but the idea that you could take in for police questioning an 8 and 9-year-old school kids under the crime of apology for terrorism, which has happened recently, is kind of mind-boggling. And the argument about the niqab, the argument about, of course, the headscarf. I mean, right from the beginning, the law was brought in to legislate a political problem because, as Andre Glucksmann, the philosopher, said, "Ces filles savent que leur foulard est taché de sang." These girls know their headscarf is stained with blood, right? So almost already there's been either a kind of an association. It's a movable target, the symbolism of the headscarf or the niqab. It's either kind of a barbarous traditionalism, or it's a radical form of contemporary revolutionary struggle. It's hard to have it to be both at the same time, but each one gets mobilized. So the political what happens, from the perspective of a constitutional thinker, is essentially, Schmitt would be happy, because the chaos doesn't rise to the top, so that the state remains and the legal order remains. But what we've seen is the legal order being fundamentally reinforced. And Mireille, I've forgotten her last name, one of the legal counsels in French. Well, there are other ways to create a state of exception. She's one of the, I'll look for the reference. She said, then creating a Patriot Act, we don't necessarily have to suspend the entire, declare a state of exception or suspend the Constitution. We can do it in other ways and end up with basically what we have today, which is a police state. So that, to me, is the most alarming part. Is less the problem of the problem of integration, the problem of inter-community relations, or the kind of stigmatization and rejection of a minority, which has been going on really since the imperial period. But what's happening at the level of a kind of, the strengthening and the legitimation of overweening state powers and a kind of police state. In France, at the rally, they were shouting, "Nous sommes tous la police." You're just like, are you kidding me? This is really worrying, that a rally around national unity should be able to say something like, that you could see signs, of solidarity about national unity, la l'union sacrée, which take the form of a kind of identification with what is looking more and more like a police state.
I'm not sure what your question is, however.
It's basically saying I thought it was a fabulous talk, and I wonder if you could perhaps say a little bit more about that shift, essentially the shift from what is essentially the fact that we basically it stopped being a political discussion. It's become almost a discussion of order, security, and therefore about state power, and it's enacted through the law. And what do you think? Is there what would be a critical tool to break that open, or are we basically screwed?
Well, yes, that Schmitt himself at a point says, well, the devil has his own legality, so it's not that the law here is right. This seems to, I think you are right, from the political discussion, this has become a discussion that involves the limits of state power, but there are certain fundamental issues that have very much changed. The idea that the state should intervene to somehow block the political process through repressive laws is an idea that, at least I would say, let's start with the 1930s, when Löwenstein starts saying, well, we have to do something. We cannot just let this go. But the circumstances have changed very much. Here, we don't really have any, we have somehow a identification between a religion or a religion that somehow overlaps with ethnic, cultural, etc., community that is not directly linked to any clearly anti-democratic objective. So while militant democracy made sense, and translating into the language of law these preoccupations having to do with security and preservation of political pluralism made sense, because you had clearly identifiable political parties, anti-democratic actors, etc., also after the World War II, in Germany against the Communist Party, etc., and now all of this doesn't make any sense anymore. You have there's no identification between those who are become the victim of this police state and an anti-democratic agenda. And what is really happening here is that we are somehow legitimizing ethnic-based classifications. That's all.
It's like an exacerbation of the kind of governmentality
Yeah.
of a neoliberal state, which gathers more and more power onto itself by excluding certain sorts of things from the public sphere.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Pamela?
I had sort of two questions. The first one is a clarification, because I didn't totally follow the militant democracy religious symbols part of your talk.
Yeah,
where you
you're
were
right. That was
saying
too fast.
Well, you were saying, so what I got of it was militant democracy is based on this paradox of limiting democratic pluralism to allow pluralism to flourish. And then the religious symbols part is disallowing religious symbols as a threat. But I just want you to say that part again a little bit more slowly.
Yeah.
But as you were speaking and talking about the passive symbols versus the powerful symbols, and speaking not as a constitutional scholar, but as an anthropologist, it made me think about the different mobility of different kinds of symbols. And clearly, in those cases, you have the passive symbol can represent the state or heritage in a way in which it's not on the body of anybody, right? It's on a wall, and it's that wall. I mean, you could hurt the wall, but the wall, someone could fix the wall. But when someone's carrying a symbol on their body, they're both. It's a powerful symbol, perhaps, but that person also becomes terribly vulnerable in this context. And you can think of it in terms of hijab or yellow stars or whatever you want to think of, right?
Correct.
And so I'm just wondering, in some ways that seems like it might have some connection to my first question, but it also, you just helped me see even more powerfully the sort of perniciousness of how a symbol can fade into heritage as opposed to a symbol that stands out on the body of somebody as religious.
Right. So sorry for having been, so somehow schematic in going through, because this was a dense talk and I was trying to put. So my argument is the following. When you look at the rationale behind all these cases and all these laws prohibiting or limiting the wearing of certain Muslim traditional attire, it seems to me pretty clear that it's all about preventing something from happening without anything really happening. The problem is the symbol. So what these legislators and these judges think the symbol really is about, gender inequality, a political agenda that is inimical to constitutional democracy, these people are loyal to the enemy and this is what their veil testifies to, etc. But there's nothing that really happens. These people do not really infringe on anybody else's right. They don't engage in any unlawful activity. But just the mere fact that they wear something is seen as adherence to a political ideology that is per se anti-democratic and at odds with democratic values. Gender inequality being used heavily here, not in the SAS. This is the first case in which the court is careful because I think it learned the lesson, but it somehow does worse because it's better to be in favor of gender equality, at least in theory, than to say that we want to live together without certain people, because that sounds to me like, not a particularly enlightened project. So I think that you can say that there is a militant democracy logic behind banning these symbols because the reason for banning them is simply that they are seen as part of a political agenda that is undemocratic, which is exactly what the German constitution says. Okay, if a party or the certain political actors have a non-democratic agenda, that's it. We're not going to wait until they do anything. So that's all I'm seeing in terms of analogy.
Yeah, I thought you had said it was the reverse. When you said it was the reverse, that's when I got confused.
And no, I think the reverse. The problem is that I do see that democracy is not a recipe for suicide. So there's a good reason for preserving the plural democratic process by excluding certain political actors. Right. But if you apply that to Muslims, then what you're doing is not preserving pluralism. You're actually limiting pluralism in order to pursue an artificial Schmittian homogeneous.
It's also, of course, deeply ironic that they care so much about gender equality.
Yeah,
when
of course.
They could maybe look at sexual assault laws and everything else. But anyway, sorry, go someone else.
Was that? Okay, right.
I really appreciate your talk very much, and again, sort of our gang of anthropologists here. I just wanted you to sort of elaborate a little bit more on something that, in a way, you sort of hint at, but I, as an anthropologist who kind of works on the Catholic Church, I'm really fascinated, which is really Carl Schmitt's take, of course, on the Roman Catholic Church and the way in which the sort of state, or the state as this kind of ideal notion of the state, mimic the kind of tensions within the Roman Catholic Church. And lots of people have begun, not some people have begun to sort of apply anthropological this concept of complexio positorum, the capacity of enclosed. But I really find it fascinating, this kind of small book that came out of Agamben, of the Sciences del Male, which is really this notion of the capacity of the Catholic Church to contain the benign and the sinister.
Yeah.
So, is it too much to ask you, as a kind of Schmitt sort of scholar in a way, or you know much more than I do, or others do know, how do we understand better this notion of the sinister within a state? Because I think that quite a lot of what's happening now is, on one level, is portraying the benign side of the states, but actually, in order to function, there has to be a complicity with the sinister. For example, in another case, and I've been working much more in Mexico, where actually that line between the state and the gang, between the sort of narco-limosna and whatever, the bribery of the church to sort of narco-trafficker, had become very clear. The narco-trafficker implied and connected very much to the state. So there is a dimension of sinisterousness, I don't know if it's English, of the state, which I find fascinating, and I think Schmitt can really help us. So I just wanted, if there's not too much, if you have any idea about it, how we could sort of work, explore, even see it. It's too much to ask anthropologists.
No, anthropologists.
No,
Right.
But it's really interesting to kind of, for us to engage with other scholars in other
and vice
fields.
versa.
Yeah, and vice versa.
So all I can say is that, well, I am not a scholar of Carl Schmitt this is not I have worked extensively on Schmitt, but I am not a scholar of Carl Schmitt in the sense of, providing any innovative theory concerning Schmitt. I am totally fascinated by the role of the church in Schmitt, because it's this idea that the church is moral. The church is capable of incorporating everything, what is morally. Somehow there is a complete lack of morality in the church, because even theologically, the Catholic Church can do with the New Testament, the Old Testament, every political system the church has been able to live with and somehow absorb. So it's a complex of opposites, because it's able to somehow embody everything, precisely because the actual significance of what the church represents is irrelevant. But its strength lies precisely in its somehow lack of moral concerns concerning the kind of political, I was looking actually for if I do have the actual quotation by Schmitt, but I don't think I have it here. In any case, what he says, the court is an institutional embodiment of the underlying unity of European political civilization, a political form which revitalizes the significance of national and class opposition. A complex of opposite, the inheritor of the Roman Empire, the living embodiment of a classical political civilization, responsible for the historical evolution of Europe, distinctive national cultures, which is also important because he sees the possibility of different sovereign states recognizing one another within the context of Europe, precisely on the basis so a unity expressed in different forms. If I find while we're talking, I'm going to actually go back to this and read you the actual quotation. I don't think I can help you much more than this.
Yeah, he has the church being its kind of the version of the 2 Thessalonians 2, what he calls it a restraining power, the katechon, in that which restrains the end, right? So Paul, in his letter to the Thessalonians, says, 2 Thessalonians 2, I believe, 2 something, I can't remember exactly, but he says, and then before coming to the end, but the restraining power is the power that essentially stops is what holds back the return and the apocalypse. So essentially, he's a counter-messianic or counter-apocalyptic thinker, and the Roman Catholic Empire was for him the kind of secular, as it were, the worldly version of this Pauline, and the, this force holding back, which Paul never identifies. We don't know what it is, holding back the chaos and the lawlessness of the present time, right? So the lawlessness is what he worries about. It's like, oh no, the kind of chaos coming from below, and that is a very anti-Jewish thinker in many ways, because clearly, from the perspective of a Jewish political philosophy, the big worry is the power from above, really. It's not, the chaos rising from below, it's the question of repression from above. And so, then I think maybe in the argument with Peterson, there's something where he talks about the question of the Catholics and the Jews. I'm not sure. The second political.
Yeah, maybe. But when you were talking, it also occurred to me that the other part is, of course, if you compare the conditions for political life of Hannah Arendt, it is very clear. The point becomes very clear. The condition for political life is the existence of man, and not of men. Just to paraphrase Goethe. So I think that's really the. Yeah.
They're all actually looking for the same thing at the time.
Of course.
They're all talking
Sure.
to one another in a way that people don't like.
Yeah. Yes.
Walter Benjamin and Schmitt
Yeah.
had an interesting conversation about those questions.
Bruce.
Well, thanks, Ben. And thanks, Susanna. That was really terrific, very rich. A lot packed in. I'm a pretty fast typer.
I'm sorry, and I know I speak too fast.
No, it was great. The timing of your talk could hardly be better.
Yeah, I understand.
Because the discussions have been going on with the Parliament this week. Such a good example, I think, of the tour exploring. I don't know if you'll have time to stop by and visit Parliament, but they should really benefit from it. I have a question, I guess, about Schmitt. I don't really know much about Schmitt, really hardly anything, but I'm just curious about why Schmitt developed these ideas, because it seems to me that the ideas you presented are very compelling and play off. But why Schmitt? And a couple of strands to that question, really, from my point of view. One, how well does his way of talking about or theorizing political community, how well does the explanatory power of his vision, because it seems to me that there is explanatory or descriptive power to it. It's not just a described a fantasy, but we can see the political dynamics. How well does that travel across the Atlantic? Or how well does it travel, let's say, to political communities that think of themselves, like say in Canada, like we tend to think of ourselves, I don't want to push aside the strings of political pressure towards homogeneity because they're very real and we hear them from the Prime Minister and stuff. But we tend to think of ourselves as a community of immigrants, shaped by immigration. And pluralism. So I'm wondering about that, whether his theory travels well. And I'm wondering, how much the why Schmitt question in terms of your thinking through is shaped by the fact that he was a Nazi, and is it part of your agenda to say the ideas he's expounding are of course abhorrent given that what we know about where they led to in the history of Nazi Germany. It feels to me like that's part of what you're inviting us to talk about, but I didn't hear it explicitly.
All right. So thank you. Yeah. Well, of course, it's not irrelevant. But that being said, clearly the context in which Schmitt theorized his model of democracy is not comparable as a whole with today's predicament, neither here nor in Europe. But I think that there are certain assonances between the situation in the Weimar Republic and certain dynamics that are at play today in Western democracies. For example, plebiscitarian temptations, a widespread criticism towards parliamentarism, identity-related claims, widespread irritation towards compromise-seeking, consensus-building, a clear preference for legitimacy over legality, which is somehow depicted as a hurdle for the exercise of sovereign powers, etc., etc. So it's not just about Schmitt being a Nazi. Is I think that Schmitt operated very intelligently, by the way. Although, of course, I mean, again, it's extremely a very pernicious line of reasoning. But as a sociologist, he certainly captured the situation. So he operated in a context that was not the same, but certainly shows very similar preoccupations and dynamics. I also would like to point out another part of Schmitt's theory, which I didn't have the time to build up, but I think is extremely important, that has to do with Schmitt's analysis of international relations and international law, which provides a very important vantage point, I think, to understand our current predicament, particularly when he looks at when we now look at the relationship between Islam and the West, because Schmitt describes very lucidly the blurring of the line between the war and peace, this ambiguous construction of the concepts of just war, which cannot escape, digging its roots in ideology, the lack of legitimacy of international justice and international law. International justice is appearing inevitably as the justice of the winners, which then becomes, of course, the source of new conflicts. So it seems to me that there's a lot there that can help. But yes, of course, the fact that he was, and I'm not so much sure that he was a Nazi in the sense that he was not even a particularly successful Nazi in the end. I mean, I'm more interested in how his political doctrine can explain today's dynamics.
Francesca?
Thank you for your wonderful talk. And I have one and three questions. The first one is a really Christian. The first one is that at the end of January, the Council of Europe made a resolution that on tackling intolerance and discrimination in Europe with a special focus on Christians. And he asked to invite the country to guarantee the full participation on the public, among other things, also to guarantee the full participation in public life by the Christians. And also to encourage the media to avoid negative stereotyping and communicating prejudice against Christians in some way as for the other group. And I'm wondering, what is the necessity to do this type of resolution right now, in this moment, in Europe? Second question is the law in Austria that you mentioned before. From some people, it seemed like something, a model for other European countries.
Yeah.
And on the contrary, some other think that is really Islamophobic. And actually, what I found really interesting that someone called this law like the creation for a European Islam. In a Schmittian way, what do you think about a European Islam? And the third part is that today, I don't know, it's a news today, but the German Constitutional Court reversed the ban on Islamic headscarf for the teacher in school after 12 years.
Yeah, after Ludin, yeah.
So, what are the common threads in all this news now in Europe, and what do you think about it?
So, thank you. I don't think it's particularly timely to somehow suggest that there should be more political recognition of majority religions, such as all this in Europe. However, since I think Casanova coined the term deprivatized religion, I think we've all been talking about the fact that religions clearly seek an increased role in the public sphere, and specifically in the political arena. Now, I didn't talk about the European Court of Human Rights cases in terms of the amicus, in terms of the kind of alliances that have been extremely important, I would say crucial. For example, to reverse the Lautzi, the crucifix decision, the alliance between the Vatican, the Russian Orthodox Church, the Italian government, various governments from Eastern European countries, and especially American evangelicals have been absolutely fundamental. So there's obviously a transatlantic, rather pernicious conversation going on there that is aimed at, somehow fighting the secularization, what they call the European Center for Law and Justice, which is the European affiliated of the American Center for Law and Justice, has been conducting battles against the reproductive rights, specifically abortion, but also use of stem cells, etc., etc. So against science, against gay marriage, against LGBT equality. et cetera, with the help and the funding of American evangelicals. So I see these, these resolutions on the role of Christians in the European public sphere as part of this. And I don't like it, just to be blunt here. And this is not something that I don't want to go in that direction. But I do see that there is there's a real, that's a real issue. By the way, I read a really troublesome declaration by the president of American United for Life, who is a very charming lady who's very often in Europe, when she said we have to really monitor this because the world has become one, and every abortion right in Europe is a challenge to America. So this is the kind of battle that these religious conservatives are fighting. So it seems to me that if we're worried about religion in the public sphere, it's not about Muslims that we should really be concerned about in Europe. There's a whole lot going on there. As to the Austrian law, I have mixed feelings, I must confess. Because I don't like the part that forces Muslims to produce like a translation of the Quran. I do see the problems in understanding that religions are not all like the Catholic religion with a pyramidal situation and the infallibility of the Pope. So one doctrine for all. Other monotheistic religions are different. There's different interpretations. So it's very difficult to force everybody into being represented by the same association. I mean, I see all this. On the fundings from outside, I have some sympathy, I must say. And all in all, on the fact that the state would control religion to a certain extent, I think that it's a plausible, part of the conversation. I mean, you have to live together. There's a point where you have to ask certain religions, if they want to be part of the public sphere, to be part of the public sphere, also giving up certain parts of autonomy. Otherwise, how can they claim? I mean, let's put it this way. Liberal Europe has a tradition of keeping religious diversity strictly in the private sphere. Okay, the idea is the public sphere is infused with Christian values, but they're secularized mainly. Okay, and diversity should be kept in the private sphere. This is no longer possible in a world where public and private somehow are completely blurred, et cetera, et cetera. So if minority religions claim equality in the private sphere, there's a point where, they will have to compromise. So I'm not, I would want to see how they're going to implement this law, but I do not have a clear-cut opposition. I don't know if it's a model for other. But I have read after Charlie Hebdo that many imams in France do claim that the French government should entitle the somehow education of imams within France, precisely to avoid the influence of of Saudi Arabia, which is the real issue here.
We have about 10 minutes left, and Leah has a question. If others do, please let me know. I just want to keep my eyes open, and then this always happens. I'll try and jam my questions in at the end.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So I just have a quick question. It seemed at the end of your presentation that you very briefly touched on how Europe seems to need Judaism or Islam to be the other. And that it made me think of Edward Said, how with Orientalism, how you identify the self as being everything the other is not. And so I was wondering, I don't know very much about Carl Schmitt at all, and so wondering, does he see this homogenous group as like a Christian group or a European group, or a group that is not Jewish or not Muslim? And if those two groups that are the others that we either fear or are uncomfortable with, if they no longer are so visibly an other in public society, like by removing the symbols or doing other steps like that, would he be happy then? Would he find that as a homogenous group? Or do you think that perhaps like within that group that could be seen as homogenous when being compared to Jews or Muslims, would there then be further subdivisions within that group? And would he ever be happy, do you think? Or I know that's a broad question, but it just, to me, it seems like if you can only identify the self as being everything the other is not, I just don't think you could be a self if there was no other.
No, on the other hand, neither the self nor the other are just what the other is not. So I think this is very important. That what you're saying is also very important when it comes to the gender equality question, because very clearly there is a projection onto this patriarchal other par excellence of a number of unresolved questions concerning the role of gender in protocols of interaction, etc., in Western societies. So the whole Sayedian paradigm is very useful here. Schmitt is not interested in any kind of social mediation, so I'm not sure how happy or unhappy he would be. I mean, he sees the relationship with the other in terms of pure incommunicability, so I'm not sure how much giving up symbols, etc., would be enough for him. But I do think that the Sayedian is extremely useful. Also, if you take into account the whole understanding of the secularization of theological concepts that then become political, this is very. I think Gil, what's his name? Nijar has done a whole bound of job, right? In the LRST history of the enemy, right? That he goes through, yeah. And it's a philosophy of the animist.
Schmitt takes up Schmitt.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thinks about it in that context.
Yeah.
And in fact, that's, in a sense, it was going to be one of the questions I had, and I'll just kind of float a couple, and you can pick as you see fit. But it's exactly, I was hearing Anajar and sort of part of what you were describing, and so one question, sort of, I guess, sort of sharply put, was in the politics that you're describing, what becomes of the European Jew in what you're constructing and what you're diagnosing, and so one way in which the argument sounds is almost a kind of replacement, where the Muslim starts to occupy that internal theological location of the Jew, and yet the Jew persists in Europe. And so the question is,
I know.
My question to you is sort of the political fate of the Jew in this, which of course in France is very complicated, and so there's a bit of that, and then the other, I was wondering really what role universalism is playing in this, which side of the balance sheet it's on, but also really the core of my interest was whether there is actually something theological in this as well, and how much of, is there a kind, so in a way it's Leah's question, which is to say, so if you were to take yet another strand of Schmitt, the sort of political theology and the migration of ideas, does that have anything to shed light on what's happening here? Is it as structural as you're describing, as he describes in these other places, than as you're using it? Or is there actually kind of is there a theological content in what's taking place in the politics that you're describing? And I really ask that not as an assertion that there is, but as a genuine curiosity, if there actually is a kind of abiding theological component to everything that you're describing.
I think there is. I've been thinking about this and I have not come to a conclusion. We had a really interesting seminar on the new constitutional theology, in effect, in London not long ago, and since then this has been somehow, but I want to come back another time and talk about this because I think it's a totally fascinating. But my sense is, yes, there is. Let's do something on anti-Semitism in Europe and the role of Jews. I think this is it's one of the most troubling issues. Now, of course, Netanyahu has a very easy way out, prompting all the Jews of France of going to Israel, so the problem is solved, right? But I do see that this is getting increasingly complicated because on the one hand, Muslims are certainly becoming somehow the new scapegoat or the new other, etc., etc. On the other hand, anti-Semitism is also a huge component of a lot of Muslim internal dynamics. It's a different kind of anti-Semitism, though, because it's far more political. It's not so much of a cultural, racist, etc., etc. It's a real political fight. So very different dimensions of anti-Semitism in Europe seem to be overlapping. And I heard Sheila Ben Habib asking exactly the same question 2 weeks ago to Niloufer Goleh, who was trying to, come up with some, with some optimistic post-Charlie Hebdo solution.
The perfect place. That'll leave it for a future conversation, and it's always a good sign when we're a little bit frustrated at the end.
Or if I can just piggyback on that, how the Vatican, also how the Holy See and the Vatican is also working through the sort of Pontifical Commission to actually insert
itself in these discussions about
Absolutely, yes.
constitutionalism. So it's coming.
Oh no, absolutely, and also this is really interesting because it's also due very much to the presence of Catholic intellectuals in America that are somehow less somehow furiously anti-intellectual. They're Protestants that have been traditionally since the Reagan time active in the and they have really been able to completely change the many elements of this conversation by appealing to natural law, et cetera, et cetera. So there's of course all that. All right.
Well, I hope you'll join me.